So I had one of these whipsaw mornings where the very first email I read when I woke up was from someone in Italy who had seen me give a lecture and said, "It was the very best lecture I've ever seen, the very best presentation I've ever seen, thank you." And then the very next email I received was from another person who had seen the lecture in Italy and said, "Boy, that was such a great lecture, but 99% of the people don't understand anything you're saying." And I thought, geez, really? 99%? So I really struggled hard today to make it so that at least only 93% of the people won't understand everything I say. Or at least I'm hoping that the rankings are much higher here in Florida than they are in Italy about this issue I know you care something deeply about. But the strategy I'm going to use to bring you in here is to start very, very low. I want to ask you to think for a second about a very dark idea. Think, for example, that you discovered your dad had Alzheimer's or your son had a problem with alcohol. And think what that feeling is as you slowly come to recognize that this is not a problem you can ignore. It's not a problem you can just put aside. As you slowly, reluctantly come to realize this is something you've got to deal with. Okay, nothing else is as depressing in the whole of my talk, I promise. That's the bottom. Here we go. Let's start going up a little bit. In 1994, June, Intel engineers discovered that they had a problem with their Pentium chip. At its core was a flaw. Deep in the code of the SRT algorithm to calculate the intermediate quotients necessary for iterative floating point divisions. I practiced that. It's not that I understand what that means, right? There was a flaw. And that error meant that there was a certain probability that the results would be in error. Chance of that happening, about 1 in 360 billion. So they calculated what the chance was, the mean time to failure in different applications that you might have. Word processing never, spreadsheet 27,000 years, and so on. Not, it seemed, a significant, huge problem. Nonetheless, a flaw, an error, a mistake at the core of this chip. Well, it turned out America was not going to stand by quietly as Intel put at risk their fantasy baseball spreadsheets. And there was something of a revolution in response to this flaw. People across the world coming out in the streets, okay, not actually, but a revolution here as people rose up and demanded that Intel fix the flaw. Demanded this change. And Intel had to put aside about $500 million to cover the expected cost of replacing the chip, and literally millions had their chips replaced to fix the flaw. Now, I tell this story to orient the question that's at the center of this talk. How do we respond when other platforms have flaws like this? Other platforms have these systematic errors, not just technological platforms, but policy platforms as well. For if we had a revolution to protect the spreadsheet, what do we do in other contexts? What do we do with other platforms for other errors? I want to talk to you today about 3 contexts of policy battles that are particularly relevant to this industry. We think of them as internet policy battles. These policy battles, number 1, in the context of broadband policy, number 2, in the context of cybersecurity policy, and number 3, in the context, briefly, of copyright. I want to offer you what I think of as clues to the right answer in each of these contexts, but I want to point to questions we should be raising about the process by which we come to those answers in each of these 3 contexts. So first, think about the context of broadband. which the DC Circuit has made extremely timely by releasing this decision, the Comcast versus the FCC decision, which essentially reversed the FCC's network neutrality policy. Network neutrality, meaning a policy against a certain kind of discrimination by owners of a broadband platform. Network neutrality policy reversed. Actually, it's not the case that the policy was reversed. It's just that the court held that the particular jurisdictional hook, the law or the provision under which the FCC had regulated, was improper. So the FCC has jurisdiction to enforce the Communications Act, which has 6 titles. Title II is telecom. In the broadband context, that means DSL. Title VI is cable. The FCC had said that under the general provisions of Title I, it would have the authority to promulgate network neutrality regulations, and the DC Circuit said no. Now, if they want to, the FCC has lots of ways that it can reissue these regulations consistent with the opinion of the DC Circuit. It could reclassify broadband services in a way that makes it subject to Title II regulation. And if President Obama wants to, he could reverse the effect of this regulation, at least by getting Congress to go along with legislation to enact into law, as many senators have already proposed, network neutrality rules. So will the FCC do this, or will the president do this? Well, we have to answer this question in the context of this long-standing debate about telecommunication infrastructure in the United States. The United States is broadband challenged. Relative to the rest of the world, we are broadband challenged. Now, something like 15th to 17th, depending on how you aggregate the various components of measurements. The United States is way below where it's supposed to be given its power as a technology innovator. But we should remember it wasn't always like this. In the 1990s, a time when there were thousands of ISPs, literally thousands of narrowband dial-up ISPs, there was extraordinary competition that meant the United States led the world in that initial stage of access to the internet. Why was there that competition? Well, it has nothing to do with the internet, per se. The hero in this story was a company called MCI. And the story of MCI becoming the hero is a story, like all stories, that begins like this. Once upon a time, there was a company. 1889, its logo was that. In 1900, it was that. In 1921, it was that. In 1939, it was that. 1964, it was that. And between 1969 and 83, AT&T's logo was that. For that whole period of time, this was the effective, dominant communications infrastructure, and for most of that time, from about the 1914 period to 1982, it was a state-sanctioned monopoly. AT&T owned the physical platform, and that meant it got to control the platform. In particular, it got to control innovation on that platform. So, for example, this device, a piece of metal called the hushaphone that was to fit over an early telephone pedestal phone. 1948, AT&T decided it would not allow the hushaphone on its network. In filings before the government, AT&T said, the use of a hushaphone affects more than the conversation of the user. Its influence pervades the whole telephone system. Now remember, it was a piece of metal that sat on top of the telephone. It didn't engage with the electronics, so to speak, of the telephone at all. All it did was use acoustic muffling to make it easier to hear and speak on that telephone. But AT&T couldn't have it because it was innovation AT&T didn't control, and the government allowed them to block it. because AT&T was the favored monopoly of the day, the apple pie monopoly of the day, the everyone loves monopoly of the day, the stable, functional, popular monopoly of the day. I'm sorry, not Apple, AT&T. And it was rooted on by the government. But then things changed. This monopoly became a disfavored monopoly. One of the early technical moments when this happened was the development of this thing called the Carter phone. The Carter phone allowed you to plug a telephone into a telephone system and then broadcast the telephone conversation across, for example, a workplace. AT&T tried to stop the development and sale of the Carter phone, but the DC Circuit said AT&T had to allow this attachment to their system, so long as there was no showing the attachment did any harm. The government, through the DC Circuit, began to impose a non-discrimination rule for attachments. The mere fact you didn't invent it didn't mean you could block it, so long as you couldn't show it was harming your network. And MCI was born because of this rule. Long-distance competition was possible because people attached devices to the network that would eventually enable cheap long-distance telephone calls. AT&T fought that innovation, but the extraordinary benefit in low-cost long-distance calls poisoned the public's long-standing support for this favored monopoly. And in 1982, the Reagan Justice Department negotiated a consent decree that would lead to the breakup of AT&T. That was their new logo. A breakup that would be guided by two fundamental principles of telecommunications law. Number one, non-discrimination, and number two, unbundling. Non-discrimination meaning you could attach what you wanted so long as it was not harmful to the network. You couldn't discriminate against somebody just because they weren't your company. And unbundle meaning you would have to unbundle access to the customer over your lines. And these principles then got embodied into the major overhaul of the telecommunications law in 1996, the first since the 34 statute, principles of non-discrimination and unbundling, and those principles are what made possible narrowband ISPs. Because those principles, number one, allowed you to connect a modem to your telephone line without the permission of AT&T, and it disallowed AT&T from doing what it wanted to do, or the Baby Bells from doing what they wanted to do, namely to discriminate by charging you higher prices for your data use of your telephone line than you otherwise were paying for voice use of your telephone line. The government banned that, which meant you could use these devices to layer on top of their proprietary network what became the open standards of the internet. And competition here flourished, producing the thousands of ISPs that existed in the middle part of the 1990s. But that was just narrowband. And the 96 Act had as its objective also competition in broadband. But the problem was they, not surprisingly, it's Congress, implemented this inconsistently. These principles of non-discrimination and unbundling applied inconsistently. So they applied to DSL because DSL came across the telephone network, so it was subject to the traditional rules that governed AT&T, but they didn't apply it to cable. Even though cable was now being used or would be used for internet service, the tradition of cable was never non-discrimination and never unbundle access to the customer. So DSL would be open access and cable would not. Now that inconsistency produced an obvious effect, what we call the open access wars, as the Baby Bells, because they had to unbundle and the cable companies did not, engage in a series of policy battles between 97 and 2000 to try to create a single rule across both platforms. And this policy war was fierce for that period of time. And the argument in favor of open access was that it would encourage competition, and it could encourage competition in the cable space as well as the DSL space. And the argument against, made by cable companies and eventually by telephone companies, was that this rule would stifle investment. Well, those wars were resolved on December 12, 2000, by the United States Supreme Court in an unrelated case called Bush v. Gore. And by deciding Bush v. Gore in the way that the court decided it, it shifted the regulatory policy, in particular at the FCC, strongly against open access. And the FCC reclassified all broadband service, whether DSL or cable, to be an information service, which meant they were allowed to forbear any regulation of those services. And eventually the Supreme Court in 2005 would uphold this rule that meant that there was no open access requirement for any broadband service, whether DSL or cable. So we went from a rule where half of broadband was open access to a world where no broadband was open access. Now, amazingly, the world didn't follow us. The world did follow us in 1996 when we said open access would be the rule. The world embraced that principle of open access. Japan, France, Korea, the UK, Germany, they all adopted regulations that were parallel to ours that would require the telephone provider to open the lines to competing ISPs. But when we reversed ourselves, they didn't follow us. They kept the same open access policies. So that meant for the whole of the 21st century, the USA has had this unregulated broadband access, and the world has had open access, which means regulation that force access and therefore more competition. Now, as I think about this debate, I feel a little bit like an old man here, because I feel like I've been watching this debate for the whole of the history of the internet, and I remember when those decisions were originally made, an FCC commissioner saying to me, we're going to have a natural experiment here, and we're going to see which system works better, open access or the unregulated platform. And his bet was that the unregulated platform would work better, and my bet was that open access was going to work better. Okay, so that's the context. Barack Obama gets elected. Broadband is central to his platform. The FCC has a new chairman, Julius Giannakowski, who is fundamentally committed to making broadband as accessible and as cheap as the FCC possibly can. In response to a demand by Congress, they launch a project to produce a national broadband plan. And in preparation of for this plan, the FCC commissioned a bunch of studies. And one of the studies the FCC commissioned was a study of broadband practices internationally. It was a study conducted at Harvard's Berkman Center, headed by Yochai Benkler, a review of international broadband transitions and policies from around the world. And I should confess a certain disclosure here. Though I'm not associated with the Berkman Center and I don't get any money from the Berkman Center, I happen to think Yochai Benkler is one of the two smartest people in this business. And so I am naturally biased to believe anything he says. So you can qualify what you hear from now on based on that disclosure. But astonishingly, this study produced some clear findings. First, as you all know, the differences in access and price between the United States and the rest of our comparable world are huge. So, one example in the study, France. For $33 a month in France, this is what you can buy: 20 megabit broadband, HD TV, unlimited long distance and international telephone calling in 70 countries around the world, and depending upon the local space, wireless service for your laptop through local partnerships with companies across France. That is the triple option play or the quadruple option play in France. The equivalent in the United States is many times that price. So number one, the price and access is better across our competitors, and not just in concentrated places like Japan and in Korea, but in places like France and Britain. And number two, much of this difference can be explained by a difference in policy. Wherever open access was, we had broad, faster, cheaper broadband because of the competition. As the report puts it, the lowest prices and highest speeds are almost always offered by firms in markets where, in addition to an incumbent telephone company and cable company, there are also competitors who entered the market and built their presence through the use of open access facilities. So, the history of broadband in our world looks something like this. Up to 2000, we followed the same pattern, and after 2000, we diverged, and the world got better broadband, and we got worse broadband. And the key difference here was government policy. So the broadband plan asked for this study. How did they incorporate it? How did they respond to it? We ran this global experiment, as I was told by the commissioner of the FCC, of regulation and deregulation. The data demonstrate we were wrong. And this president launched an administration that was based on what they called the reality-based community. I don't know if you remember, during the Bush administration, Ron Suskind made fun of a Bush administration official who said, quote, "You believe that solutions emerge from judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore." So they made fun of the Bush administration because that was their conception of policy, while the Obama administration said they were committed to reality-based policy. So here was the reality. How did they accommodate this reality in their report? They ignored it. There is one footnote in this 358-page report that refers to the study they commissioned and not for the conclusions which the study provided. And the words open access appear nowhere in the whole of the 356 pages of that report. Why? Well, as Benkler put it in an op-ed describing this experience, senior commission staff members have essentially conceded that lobbying pressure from the monopolies is too strong even to begin exploring open access right now. This is Blair Levin, who was the head of the
First of all, as to the unbundling
project
and the ideas of unbundling and structural separation, the Berkman study did a fantastic job, I think, of pointing out kind of various things that were going on throughout the world. But I think that we asked them to do that, and we very much wanted to have an understanding of what was going on in the world. But there are certain things where what is happening in some countries really isn't that germane to helping us figure out how do we go, where do we go from here. And I would just point out that as to unbundling, look, the courts threw that out, and we're not that terribly interested in moving toward things which will just freeze capital investment and have long, complicated court battles.
So listen to what he said. First, not so interested in what other countries did. I don't quite understand why. Maybe the markets work differently in other countries, or the physics is different in other countries. I don't know which of those two things to point to. Number two, the courts had thrown it out, but the courts had thrown it out only because the FCC had improperly classified. And number three, he's not interested in pursuing a policy that was going to be blocked by the incumbents who are going to fight it. So as broadbandDSLreports.com put it, Levin is basically admitting defeat at the hands of the biggest operators in the court before even trying anything, something AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast lawyers surely would appreciate. But as the Economist put it in quite a powerful indictment of the FCC, almost unique among OECD countries, America has adopted no policies to require owners of broadband cables to open their infrastructure to rival sellers in order to enhance competition. America relies almost exclusively on facilities competition the provision of rival infrastructures. True, there is a legitimate worry that forcing a company to rent out parts of its infrastructure to competitors may deter investment, but a review of broadband policies by the Berkman Center revealed a range of successful compromises in use in other countries. The FCC has availed itself of none of them and suggests that wireless broadband could instead provide more competition. But wireless data transfer is much slower and less reliable. It is more a complement than a competitor. If America's facilities-based system were really working, the country would, at the very least, enjoy first-rate broadband in dense urban areas where providers are most likely to recoup their investments quickly. Yet in February, Oxford and some university I can't begin to pronounce released a study that produced a broadband quality score based on bit volume and speed mapped against current and probable future applications. Chicago, America's best performing city, ranked 26th, below Sofia and Bucharest. No American city was judged ready for tomorrow. Among countries, America ranked 16th, which is roughly where it falls on almost any available measure of broadband penetration or quality. That, the Economist said, and I would agree with the Economist, is not good enough. Yet here's what's clear. This core policymaker in the context of these decisions is judging what's right based on what's politically possible, where politically possible doesn't mean what the voters want, but politically possible means a function of the power of the incumbents. That's one area, broadband. Think about a second, cybersecurity. Secretary Clinton recently gave an important statement about internet freedom and about cybersecurity. As she said in her statement, countries or individuals that engage in cyber attacks should face consequences and international condemnation. But an op-ed written in the Washington Post by a former Bush administration official, Jack Goldsmith said, but the problem with Clinton's call for accountability and the norms on the global network is the enormous array of cyber attacks originating from the United States. And until we acknowledge these attacks and signal how we might control them, we cannot make progress on preventing cyber attacks emanating from other countries. Now, why is it we have these problems? Well, this is Jonathan Zittrain, the other most genius person I know in this field. He wrote this book, extraordinary cover as well as a book, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. See, one edge it goes off the cliff, and the other edge at least more hopeful. As Zittrain describes the past of the Internet, he says the critical feature of the past of the Internet was the generative technologies at its core, and two technologies are in particular the cause of this generative infrastructure. Number one, the PC, general purpose computers, which would run whatever code you put into it to run. And number two, a network, which had an architecture of end-to-end design, a therefore neutral network, which would go wherever or do whatever you told it to run. Those two factors together produced this explosion of innovation, and that was the happy story of the Internet. But there's a sad part to this story as well, because of course, any means both good and bad. So the innovations which this generative network would encourage include viruses or spam or zombie bots or malware in general. Those too are part of the explosion of innovation that the Internet encouraged. And the extraordinary consequence of the malware is something that most public policy people don't begin to want to even recognize. So for example, at one time, 15% of the entire search capacity of Yahoo was being used by a single bot searching for random text to make it possible to insert into spam to make the spam work, 15%. Or a researcher at Dragon discovered 30 million computers infected with certain bots reporting, had you told me 5 years ago, this is 2006, that organized crime would control 1 out of every 10 home machines on the Internet, I would not have believed that. Zittrain also points to the rise in these coordinated attacks. For $50,000, you can get and launch a coordinated attack on a site. IBM Security in 2005 reported 40% rise in the machines that were compromised, all of them compromised remotely, half of those machines granting full access to the zombie bot that had compromised them. And of course, patch times to fix these problems are rising. Cleaning the machines is often not even an option. As one Microsoft document described, when you're dealing with rootkits and some advanced spyware programs, the only solution is to rebuild from scratch. In some cases, there really is no way to recover without nuking the systems from orbit. I assume that's just a metaphorical statement there. So why have we produced no solution to this problem? Well, there are two separate interests here: commercial interest and government interest. The commercial interests are defined by an anti-spam movement. So, spam is to cybersecurity as rats are to the bubonic plague. It's not that spam itself is the cybersecurity or insecurity, but they're carriers or enablers, or the technology developed to enable spam to spread so broadly gets easily used for this more malicious purpose. And this fact led many to say that there was a role for regulation here, sensible regulation that could control or limit at least the incentives to spread rats throughout the network, to facilitate what we could call consensual communications rather than the kind of communications spam encourages. But every sensible plan to affect that regulation over the past 15 years has been killed by the rats of this context, who have decided that it would be too burdensome to them to face or comply with these regulations, and therefore have dumped an enormous amount of money into Congress to stop these regulations. So while in the context of copyright, we've had more than 24 statutes enacted to strengthen the place of copyright over the last decade, in spam, we've had just one statute enacted, and that statute, of course, is hopelessly ineffective for stopping this carrier of insecurity, and therefore the carrier of insecurity thrives in this context. So that's the commercial interest, but the government also has an interest here. This is more speculative, but when you ask the question, why doesn't the government launch a more effective effort to stop this, Goldsmith points to an obvious embarrassment. The United States, as a source of computer network attacks, is not just that the United States has a lot of networks that facilitate the attack, but that the United States government itself deploys technologies to facilitate these attacks. The United States wants changes different from simply making the net safe as well. This is the more troubling story. Zittrain says, if you look at the way these malware technologies are spreading, it is just a matter of time until we have what you could think of as an I-9/11 event, by which I don't mean Al-Qaeda launches a terrorist attack using our networks, but that either intentionally or accidentally, one of these system-wide attacks gets to be so significant that it brings down a huge proportion or a large enough proportion of the network to create the political will to respond. Now remember, after 9/11, there was this statute that was passed, the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. You wonder, how do they come up with titles like that? Because they compress to a very nice Patriot Act, shortening. The Patriot Act, thousands of pages of regulation. And the question was asked, how could Congress write it so quickly? How could you actually compose it so quickly? It was just a couple weeks after 9/11. And the answer is, the Justice Department had in what drawer the Patriot Act for many, many years. Their wish list of compromises of civil rights necessary to deal with an emergency. And when there was this emergency, then by magic, they produced it, and it was passed by Congress. Now that pattern leads Zittrain and others to wonder, is the same true with the internet? When there's an I-9/11 event, will there be an I-Patriot Act? Is such a statute sitting in the Justice Department drawer somewhere, waiting for the political will necessary to pass it? I had the opportunity to ask this man that question, a man who was intimately involved in cybersecurity. His response, of course there is, and Vint Cerf is not going to like it very much. So the suggestion is that the government here can use this insecurity to wage a war eventually against Vint's internet. These two interests, then, in this sense, combine to keep the net unsafe today, to facilitate radically remaking the net at some future moment. So again, what's right is a function of what's politically possible, not possible as far as the voter's concerned, but possible as far as powerful incumbents, this time commercial, and the government. And then finally, more briefly, think about copyright. So I've spent a decade of my life fighting in the context of copyright. I've written many books, but these two most recent books focus the story that I'm going to tell in about 30 seconds here about copyright. In my view, copyright, even in a digital age, is an essential and important right that is essential to make sure that professional culture can be produced and flourish. But what's obvious to anybody not in the employ of the copyright industry is that the current architecture of copyright was architected in light of 19th and 20th century technologies. And a copyright law so architected produced insane results in the context of a digital architecture. So if the core of copyright is to regulate something called, quote, copies, then in the pre-internet age, the analog world, what that meant is many uses of creative work were copyright-free. But in the digital world, very few uses of copyrighted work are copyright-free, because in the digital world, practically all uses trigger copyright. So for example, think about a physical book in real space. If these are all the uses of a book in real space, an important set of those uses are technically unregulated by the law. So to read a book is a free use of a book, because to read a book is not to produce a copy. To give someone a book is a free use of the book, because to give someone a book is not to produce a copy. To sell a book is, under American law, explicitly exempt from the regulation of copyright, because to sell a book is not to produce a copy. To sleep on a book in no jurisdiction anywhere in the world is subject to the regulation of copyright, because copies are not produced when you sleep on the book, regardless of what you might dream about. Now, these unregulated uses are then balanced with an important set of regulated uses, regulated to create the incentives that creators and authors need to produce great new works. And in the American tradition, there's a thin sliver of exceptions called fair uses, uses which otherwise would be regulated by the law, but which the law says ought to remain free for the purpose of encouraging critique or encouraging new kinds of innovation. So unregulated, regulated, and fair uses enter the net, where every single use produces a copy. And that means this balance between regulated, unregulated, and fair uses radically changes merely because the platform through which we get access to our culture has changed. Not because policymakers decided it would change, but because technologists produced a digital world where copying is as common as breathing to displace the analog world where copying was the exception. Now, obviously, what we need is a copyright law in tune with the times, meaning the technologies of the times, meaning we need to update it to fit this technology, producing the incentives it needs to produce without producing unnecessary and burdensome regulation. But we have seen no such change proposed by anyone powerful in our Congress. And why? Why do we have the existing rules still? Well, because these rules create a new baseline. And those who benefit from those baseline, those who benefit from a world where now they can regulate every single copy, meaning every single use, fight like hell to keep that baseline. They were given this gift by the accident of the intersection between copyright law and the architecture of digital technologies, and now they demand to keep it. So, for example, Google's book search project, which attempted to Googleize physical books, promised to give at least snippet access to all presumptively copyrighted works. Here is the snippet access. And they did this essentially by building just an index of all of these books. You couldn't download the full copy of a copyrighted book. This is all you could get. So they were building an index, a modern version of the card catalog. The response of the Publishing and Authors Guild was this was, quote, piracy? But what if somebody had said in 1930 that this was piracy? What if somebody had conceived of the idea of indexing and making accessible books as an act of piracy, because in that context, access to a valuable commercial product was made? But under the technical rules of copyright, to produce that index, Google has to copy, and copying triggers copyright law, requiring an exception of fair use only if Google could win a lawsuit demanding it. So once again, what's clear is what's right here, meaning updating copyright law or not, is a function of what's politically possible. What's politically possible is not a function of voters. What's politically possible is a function of powerful incumbents. In all three contexts, it's the same dynamic. Critical policy questions that the incumbent can use the power to deflect from sanity. So in broadband, critical policy to get a policy that maximizes speed and penetration. The duopoly doesn't like it, so it stops that. Cybersecurity, critical objective to get a policy that minimizes the insecurity here. A different duopoly, the DMA and the US government doesn't like that, apparently, so it stops that. Copyright, a policy that maximizes commercial and amateur creativity without waging wars here, a war which my friend, the late Jack Valenti, used to refer to as his own, quote, terrorist war, a war where apparently the terrorists are our children. But sensible policy here would recognize, as I'm sure everybody in this room recognizes, that we can't kill these technologies, we can only criminalize them. We're not going to stop our kids from using these technologies. We can only drive their creativity underground. We can't make our kids passive in the way at least I was growing up, just couch potato-like consuming whatever I could consume. We can only make our kids, quote, pirates. And the question we should be asking is that any good? Our kids live in this age of prohibition, constantly live life against the law, and that itself is corrosive and corrupting of the rule of law, especially in a democracy. Yet, Hollywood doesn't like the changes that might adapt copyright law to a digital technology, so they're not even proposed in Congress today. In all three, the incumbents use their power to pervert the policy-making process in contexts which you in this room should feel enormously connected to. Now, you hear this story and you might think, okay, wait, this is a dog bites man story. This is of course, this is how the system works. But what we need to recognize is, in fact, there is something new here. As Robert Kaiser describes in this fantastic new book, there is something new here in the change the way Washington works, given because of the rise of the power of this industry. Lobbying has produced a certain kind of economy. The economy has three components: lobbyists, members of Congress, and interests. Each pays the other. Each depends upon the other. So lobbyists pay members during and after their time in Congress. During, lobbyists pay them with cash. Not brown paper bag cash. That's the 19th century form of corruption. But support for campaigns, as the cost of campaigns has gone through the roof and members spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress. Members thus become dependent upon lobbyists as suppliers, or to push the metaphor just a bit, lobbyists as pushers in this economy. And then after life in Congress, lobbyists pay members with their future. So as my friend Jim Cooper describes Capitol Hill now, Capitol Hill has become a, quote, farm league for K Street. Members and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model in their head. It's a model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. 50% of senators between 1998 and 2004 became lobbyists, according to Public Citizen, 42% of members of the House. And the members and the staffers then depend, if they're going to do this, upon this system surviving. That's how the lobbyists affect pay to members. Then members pay the interest through policies that get changed, sometimes profitably. So this University of Kansas study estimated that the return on investment for the lobbying necessary to change the American Jobs Creation Act in the particular way they got it changed was 22,000%. Pretty good return, suggesting why many more people spend many more dollars in Washington rather than investing in the next great mousetrap. Or this study just released in the American Journal of Political Science demonstrates that large companies lobbying to change their tax rates receive, for every $1 spent in lobbying, taxes lowered effectively by between $6 and $20. So again, wonderful returns, much better than what ordinary investment might get you. So sometimes profitably, sometimes brazenly. New York Times had this story in the beginning of February about Chuck Schumer going to Wall Street to raise money for the Democrats and for himself, but meeting a chilly reception from Wall Street. Titans of finance at a closed-door meeting accused him of being insufficiently pro-Wall Street. One indignant fellow stood up and demanded his donation back. Now remember, this is Chuck Schumer. No United States senator is more responsible for turning over complete deregulation to Wall Street than Chuck Schumer, but he is the one who is insufficiently pro-Wall Street. So members pay interest because of this kind of pressure. Then the interest pay the lobbyists. This is an industry about the size of the American recording industry, which has produced enormous wealth in Washington. This man, the guy who invented the way earmarks are used right now, Gerald Cassidy, amassed more than $100 million in personal wealth from his life as a lobbyist. And as the lobbyist wealth has gone up, Washington's wealth has gone up. Washington is now one of the richest areas in the United States. In 2007, 7 of the top 20 counties in the United States were around Washington because, of course, it turns out the business of selling policy is a very profitable business. It is an economy, Kaiser describes, an economy, I insist, that produces a certain kind of dependency, a dependency that displaces what our framers imagined, where the Congress was dependent upon the people, to a Congress dependent upon the funders. It is the fund-raising Congress, status quo Congress, protecting the status quo because of its dependence upon these funders, the funders of the status quo. So, for example, in the context of copyright again, I became an activist in the context of copyright on October 27th, 1998. When President Clinton signed into a law a statute honoring this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, statute that extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. Question Congress was supposed to be asking was, did this advance the public good? Remember, a copyright is a monopoly we give an author for the purpose of creating something new. The one thing we know about incentives, at least in this universe, not the Star Trek universe, but this universe, is that incentives are prospective. No matter what the United States Congress does, George Gershwin is not going to produce anything else. So it can't possibly advance the public good to extend the term of existing copyright. And so clear was that this liberal economist, oh wait, I'm sorry, that's Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize-winning economist, agreed to join our brief challenging the statute in the Supreme Court, arguing that there could be no public benefit from such an extension only if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. So clear was it that there could be no advance of the public good, but apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress passed the statute. Overwhelmingly, 2 members opposing an easy public policy question Congress got wrong because they couldn't afford to get it right. And the list here is endless. Financial services, global warming, whatever your issue is, we can point to exactly the same dynamic. Now people say to me, yeah, but what about healthcare? Hasn't Barack changed D.C.? Isn't that what the healthcare victory shows us? Ezra Klein of the Washington Post, usually one of the best commentators on this issue, wrote an article about the twilight of the interest groups. As he said, the Obama administration succeeded at neutralizing every single industry. You know, I wish Ezra were right. My view is closer to Glenn Greenwald's. As Glenn Greenwald wrote, if by neutralizing, Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefits, then he's absolutely right. But being able to force the government to bribe and accommodate you is not a reflection of your powerlessness, quite the opposite. Pretending that this bill represents the twilight of the interest groups, that special interests have been neutralized, is just hagiography and propaganda. The way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it had to be done that way, but one cannot reasonably deny that it was. Evoking my favorite philosopher of the 20th and 21st century, David Byrne, this is same as it ever was. Once again, status quo can stall any reform, and the product is insane policy everywhere. Endlessly clear here that right has become what's a function of politically possibility. Politically possible is not what the voters want. Politically possible is what powerful incumbents demand. So come back to Intel and its, quote, flaw. And think with me for a second about the bizarreness of the revolution against an Intel chip and ask where the revolution is against this flawed operating system. We rise up to demand replacement of our chips so our fantasy baseball games go on without any question. But we do nada in response to this fundamental flaw in how our system accounts for public interest. This dependency, this debilitating dependency, that is the way our Congress functions. We do nothing to change. We know what dependencies are like. Think back to the question I asked you to think of in the very first moment of my talk. Think about discovering your kid has a dependency on alcohol. If you think about the alcoholic, he could be losing his family, his job, and his liver. Those are all very, very important problems. Indeed, among the most important problems any human could face. But what we all know is that he won't solve any of those problems until he deals with his alcoholism first. And so too is it with us. There's no end to the problems that we face, from global warming, financial services, healthcare, education, even copyright. But we won't address these problems sensibly until we solve our first problem first. I was told I couldn't use any logos or pointing to any of my own groups, so I won't put this slide up where you could learn something about it. I'll just blank the screen and ask you to think about this fact we don't want to confront. The sick father, the sick son. But recognize the complexity in the emotion we have when we think about the sick father and the sick son. Is not just the depression of recognizing the problems they face, but the fact that we feel also a love for these people. And so too, we, all of us, have a love for the nation which is failing so miserably now, and we must come to care enough to do something to fix it. Thank you very much.